All right, let's handicap what's going to happen this weekend. I'll give you just some of my thoughts or some of the information that I've gathered here. Notre Dame if Notre Dame would lose the way Alabama beat Texas A&M, maybe I'm told by a source with the committee that they could lose their way out of the Final Four. If Clemson would lose a close game, they probably would still have a hard time staying in, but I don't believe that because they love those shiny objects. They want to have Trevor Lawrence in there. And Florida, if Florida beats Alabama we know is still staying in, can Florida get in? So wherever you want to go with that, whatever topic you want to dive into, if you have something to the contrary.
Yeah. So I would say Bama's a lock to be in. I think with Florida losing to LSU last week and North Carolina smashing Miami, I now think Notre Dame's in. I kind of thought like you last week. I thought, well, if Notre Dame goes out and they get blown out by Clemson, there's a possibility that they could get left out. You got to remember in 2017, Georgia got beat by Auburn by, I think it was 23 points. They still got in as a one-loss team. I think with Notre Dame's resume, UNC is a team the committee really likes. They certainly looked great against Miami last week, and they've beaten Clemson already. I think you could take a one-loss Notre Dame resume and put it up against a 6-0 Ohio State, or even an 8-1 Texas A&M, whose best win would be the Gators, who, by the way, after this weekend might be a 3-loss team. Clemson, if they lose, the Notre Dame Clemson game to me is really the kind of the interesting story in this, because if Notre Dame wins, Clemson loses, you've got a 2-loss Clemson that's lost twice to the number 2 team in the country. What does that look like against, say, an 8-1 Texas A&M? Clemson's resume, if they lose, wouldn't necessarily be great. Not just being a 2-loss team, and we've never seen a 2-loss team get in. Their best win is 18 Miami. There's only 2 teams on Clemson's schedule, Pittsburgh and Boston College, who currently have winning records outside of Miami. So it's not as strong as you potentially like. I do agree. I think people think that with Trevor Lawrence on the field, people expect them to win that game. If Notre Dame loses this weekend, do they fall from 2 to 3? And then does the committee rematch Clemson and Notre Dame for a third time? Is that something that the committee would talk about? Do we really want to see this again? What if it's a close game? And you say, well, Notre Dame won the first in double OT, Clemson won the second. Yeah, let's let them do it again. Or would they move Notre Dame down purposely to 4 and maybe Ohio State up to avoid that rematch? There's another possibility. I mean, Texas A&M, if Notre Dame wins, could slide into number 4. And now you've got that Bama Texas A&M rematch. And you mentioned they got beat by 28 points the first time. So there are rematch scenarios very alive this weekend. Be interesting to see how the committee decides to play that. They're not supposed to factor that into their discussion with respect to who's number 1, 2, 3, and 4. But it seems like it's common sense and it's human instinct just to have to at least factor that in and consider it.
Yeah, I said it's a TV show, and I get criticized, but they want the 4 best schools. They want the biggest fan bases. They want eyeballs on this. A&M, if A&M had Johnny Manziel, Jesse, we would be talking about them in a different way. We don't know Texas A&M. We know their coach, and that's it. They have a quality team. We all know that. Iowa State has more shiny objects than A&M does, I think, as far as talent goes, skill position guys. USC, if USC had been in the conversation the last couple of years, we would look at them differently this year. So I just don't know what the process is that's a fair process. And maybe I'm being naive. Every other sport, they want parity. The NFL wants parity. They want to help you if you're bad. The next year, they give you an easier schedule. Baseball, they will give you the number 1 pick. College football doesn't want parity here. So as we move down the road here, next 5 years, what does college football look like if it looks any different than it does now?
It's we kind of, go into every year and we sort of have our expectation level. And, and this year was no different, even with the pandemic and shortened season for some conferences. I think people still expect Bama. They still expect Clemson. They still expect Ohio State. And then it's kind of like, hey, who else? Yeah. Who else is going to get in? With the way recruiting is going today, it's like the rich keep getting richer. And you got to give those schools credit. I mean, there's not a lot of drop off at quarterback. I think that's been one of the big factors this year for a lot of these programs and their continued success. The Texas A&M thing I think is interesting because the committee's respected them the entire time. And I think that win against the Gators has stood out in the committee's mind. They've been sitting there at number 5, I think, every college football playoff ranking. They're right there. They need help. They need Notre Dame to win. They need Alabama to win so they can say their worst loss was against the number 1 ranked team. But you're right. I mean, maybe not the headliners. Kellen Mond's very quietly had a very good year. He's been inconsistent throughout his career. 18 TDs this season, only 2 picks. They run the ball. I'd argue this is the best Jimbo Fisher's called plays on offense at any point in his collegiate career, even better than when he was at Florida State, simply because they had their best receiver opt out at the start of the year. They had another key receiver get hurt in that game against Florida, and he's had to kind of scheme guys open. They're a dominant defense. They're a really good team. If Texas A&M gets in because Clemson loses, I don't have a problem with it. But, I think that Notre Dame Clemson game, the ACC title game, I think will go a long way in kind of determining, the order of what we see 1 through 4.